The scrub brush bit into Eleanor Preston's knuckles as she worked the saloon floor on her hands and knees, the acrid smell of lye soap burning her nostrils in the sweltering Texas heat of August, 1878. She had been at this for 3 hours straight, and the proprietor of the Lucky Star Saloon in Fort Worth had made it clear that if she wanted her $2 for the week, every inch of these filthy pine boards needed to shine like new money. Eleanor paused to wipe the sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, careful not to let the caustic water touch her face. At 22 years old, she had never imagined her life would come to this, scrubbing floors in a saloon where drunk cowboys stumbled over her work and spit tobacco juice that she would have to clean up later. But after her father died 6 months ago from pneumonia, and the bank foreclosed on their small farm outside town, she had few choices. Her mother had passed when Eleanor was just a girl of 9, and she had no siblings, no relatives who would take her in, and no prospects for marriage that did not involve becoming some rancher's drudge wife. The door to the saloon swung open, letting in a blast of afternoon sunlight that temporarily blinded her. Eleanor squinted up at the silhouette of a tall man, broad-shouldered and wearing a wide-brimmed hat. Dust motes danced in the light around him like he had brought the entire prairie with him into the dim interior. "We're not open yet," she called out, her voice hoarse from breathing in soap fumes all morning. "Come back in an hour." The man stepped further inside, and the door swung shut behind him. As Eleanor's eyes adjusted, she could make out his features more clearly. He was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were a startling shade of blue-green, like creek water in summer, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how she must look, on her knees in a threadbare dress, her dark blonde hair escaping its pins to hang in damp tendrils around her face. "I'm looking for the owner," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest. "Name's Russell Whitaker. I'm here about the horse he's got for sale." "Mr. Brennan won't be back until evening," Eleanor said, sitting back on her heels. Her knees ached fiercely. "You'll have to come back then." Russell Whitaker tilted his head slightly, studying her with those unsettling eyes. "You work here." "I scrub the floors," Eleanor said, lifting her chin with as much dignity as she could muster. "And I need to get back to it if I'm going to finish before opening time." "That's hard work for a woman," he observed, not moving toward the door. Eleanor felt a flash of irritation. "It's hard work for anyone, which is precisely why I get paid to do it. Now, if you'll excuse me, sir." She turned back to her scrubbing, attacking a particularly stubborn stain with renewed vigor. She heard the jingle of spurs as Russell moved, but instead of heading for the door, his boots came into her field of vision. "Good boots," she noted, "well made and well cared for." "Not the boots of some drifter or ne'er-do-well. How much does he pay you?" Russell asked. Eleanor paused, frowning up at him. "That's hardly your concern. Humor me," she sighed. $2 a week if you must know. I do the Lucky Star on Mondays, the hotel on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the general store on Wednesdays, and the church on Fridays. Saturdays I take in mending if anyone has it. And Sundays. Sundays I try not to starve," Eleanor said tartly. "Is there a point to this interrogation, Mr. Whitaker?" "You got a name, Eleanor Preston. You live here in town, Miss Preston." "I rent a room at the boarding house on 3rd Street, Mrs. Calloway charges me $4 a month, and I make about 9 on a good month, which means I eat 1 meal a day and hope nothing unexpected happens like needing new shoes or medicine." The words came out more bitterly than she had intended, and she felt her cheeks flush. She never talked about her circumstances with strangers. There was no dignity in complaint. Russell crouched down so he was closer to her eye level, balancing easily on his heels. Up close, she could see that his face was weathered from sun and wind, with fine lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than not, though he was not smiling now. His expression was thoughtful, almost calculating. "I've got a proposition for you," he said. Eleanor's stomach dropped. She had heard those words before from men in this very saloon, and she always gave the same answer. "I'm not that kind of woman, Mr. Whitaker. I suggest you direct your propositions elsewhere." To her surprise, he looked genuinely shocked, then abashed. "No, madam, I didn't mean anything like that. I apologize if I gave that impression. I meant a business proposition. A job offer, if you will." Eleanor sat back again, her interest reluctantly piqued despite her better judgment. "What kind of job?" "I just bought a ranch about 10 miles north of here. 3,000 acres with a good water source, but the house is in sorry shape. Previous owner was a widower who let everything go after his wife died. I'm going to need someone to help get the place livable again. Cleaning, cooking, mending, that sort of thing, at least until I can get the ranch profitable enough to hire more permanent staff." "Why me?" Eleanor asked suspiciously. "You don't know me from Eve." "True enough," Russell acknowledged. "But I can see you're a hard worker and you're obviously down on your luck through no fault of your own. I'm offering fair wages, room and board included, $5 a week to start, more if the ranch does well." Eleanor's heart leaped. $5 a week with no rent to pay would be more money than she had ever had to herself. But the proposal also set off every warning bell in her mind. A young woman alone with a man on a remote ranch was a recipe for ruin, no matter how respectable the initial offer might sound. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Whitaker, but I cannot accept. My reputation, such as it is, would be completely destroyed if I went to live alone with a bachelor on his ranch. I would be unemployable, unmarriageable, and unwelcome in decent society." Russell nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer. "I thought you might say that, so I took the liberty of speaking to Reverend Matthews this morning. He and his wife have agreed to come stay at the ranch as well, at least for the first few months. Mrs. Matthews is getting on in years and has rheumatics something fierce. The Reverend thought the change of air might do her good, and they could serve as chaperones to make everything proper." Eleanor stared at him, momentarily speechless. He had thought of everything. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why go to all this trouble for someone you've never met?" Russell stood up, looking down at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Because I know what it's like to have the ground drop out from under you. And because no woman should have to scrub floors until her hands bleed just to keep a roof over her head when there's someone who can offer better." He glanced at her hands, and Eleanor realized he had noticed the raw, cracked skin, the redness from the lye soap. She wanted to hide them behind her back but forced herself to remain still. "Think about it," Russell said. "I'll be back tomorrow afternoon to talk to Brennan about that horse. If you're interested, you can give me your answer then. The offer stands regardless." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell and strode out of the saloon, leaving Eleanor kneeling on the wet floor, her mind whirling with possibilities and dangers in equal measure. She tried to focus on her work, but her thoughts kept drifting to Russell Whitaker's proposition. $5 a week, room and board. No more scrubbing floors in dim saloons while men leered at her. No more skipping meals to save pennies for rent. No more winter nights shivering in her thin blanket at the boarding house, where Mrs. Calloway kept the heat low to save on coal. But there was also the question of what would happen after those first few months, when the Reverend and his wife presumably returned to town. Would Russell Whitaker expect her to stay on without chaperones? Would his intentions remain honorable? Eleanor had learned the hard way that the world was not kind to women who made the wrong choices, however innocently. By the time she finished the floor and collected her wages from Brennan's surly bartender, the sun was beginning to set, painting the dusty streets of Fort Worth in shades of amber and crimson. Eleanor walked slowly back to the boarding house, her shoulders aching and her mind still turning over Russell's offer. Mrs. Calloway was in the kitchen when Eleanor arrived, stirring a pot of thin soup that would be supper for the boarders. The landlady was a sharp-featured woman in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. "You're late," she observed. "Supper's in 10 minutes." "I'm not very hungry," Eleanor said, which was at least partially true. Her stomach was too knotted with anxiety to think much about food. "Suit yourself. Though you look half-starved as it is, you keep skipping meals and you'll blow away in the next strong wind." Eleanor managed a weak smile and headed up the narrow stairs to her room, a cramped space under the eaves that held a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk containing all her worldly possessions. She sank down on the bed and finally allowed herself to consider what her life might be like if she accepted Russell's offer, waking up in a real house instead of this cramped room. Cooking meals in a proper kitchen instead of subsisting on bread and cheese. Working hard, yes, but working to build something instead of just scrubbing away the filth of others. And there was something else, too, something she barely wanted to acknowledge even to herself. The way Russell Whitaker had looked at her, not with pity or lust, but with a kind of respect, as if he saw her as a person rather than just a desperate woman willing to do any work for a few coins. That night, Eleanor lay awake long into the darkness, listening to the sounds of Fort Worth through her thin walls. Somewhere, a dog barked. A drunk sang off-key as he stumbled down the street. A woman laughed, high and brittle. These were the sounds of her life now, and they would be the sounds of her life forever if she did not take a chance. By morning, she had made her decision. She went about her usual Tuesday routine, scrubbing floors at the hotel, but her heart was not in it. The hotel manager commented on her distraction, and Eleanor had to force herself to concentrate and do the work properly. She could not afford to lose this position, not if Russell did not return as promised, not if his offer turned out to be some cruel jest. But when she returned to the Lucky Star on Wednesday afternoon, there he was, leaning against the bar in conversation with Brennan. Eleanor's heart kicked hard against her ribs. He had come back. Russell saw her enter and straightened up. He said something to Brennan, then crossed the room to meet her. In the full light streaming through the windows, she could see him even more clearly than before. He was handsome, she admitted to herself, but it was more than that. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet confidence that made her want to trust him despite all her hard-learned caution. "Miss Preston," he said, and she heard genuine pleasure in his voice. "I hoped I'd see you." "I've thought about your offer," Eleanor said, deciding that directness was the best approach. Her heart hammered so hard she was sure he could hear it. "I have questions before I can give you an answer." "That's fair. Ask whatever you need to know. Did you truly speak to Reverend Matthews?" "He and his wife have really agreed to come stay at your ranch." "I did. And they have. The Reverend said he'd be happy to provide you with a letter of reference if you'd like, confirming the arrangements and his confidence in my character." "That would be appreciated," Eleanor said. "What exactly would my duties be?" Russell outlined a list of tasks that sounded extensive, but not unreasonable. Cleaning and maintaining the house, cooking meals, some laundry and mending, tending a kitchen garden once they got one started, perhaps helping with preserving and canning when harvest time came. nothing she had not done on her father's farm or in her various jobs around town. And after the Reverend and his wife returned to town, she pressed. "What then?" "That depends," Russell said carefully. "By then, I'll have a better sense of whether the ranch is going to succeed or fail. If it succeeds, I'll be able to hire more help, maybe a foreman and some ranch hands, and we can make different arrangements that preserve your reputation. If it fails—" He trailed off with a shrug. "Well, then we're both looking for new prospects." "That's a lot of uncertainty," Eleanor said. "Life in the territories is uncertain," Russell replied. "I won't lie to you about that, but I can promise you fair treatment and honest work, and I can promise that I will never ask anything of you that's not proper and right." Eleanor studied his face, searching for any hint of deception or ulterior motive. She found none, only earnestness and what looked like genuine hope that she would say yes. "When would I start?" she asked. Russell's face broke into a smile that transformed his features, making him look younger and almost boyish. "You're saying yes." "I'm saying yes," Eleanor confirmed, and felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration wash through her. "Though I'll need a few days to settle my affairs in town and speak to the Reverend myself." "Of course. Take whatever time you need. Shall we say Saturday morning? I'll bring a wagon to collect you and your things, and we'll head out to the ranch." They shook hands to seal the agreement, and Eleanor was acutely aware of the calluses on Russell's palm, the warmth of his grip, the way his hand completely engulfed hers. When he released her, she felt oddly bereft. The next 2 days passed in a blur. Eleanor gave notice to all her employers, who responded with varying degrees of disappointment and disapproval. The hotel manager, a decent enough man named Porter, wished her well. Brennan at the Lucky Star merely grunted and said she had been slow anyway, which was not true, and they both knew it. The owner of the general store, elderly Mr. Simmons, looked genuinely concerned. "You be careful out there, Miss Eleanor," he said, pressing an extra $1 into her hand as a farewell bonus she had not expected. "The wilderness is hard on women alone." "I won't be alone," Eleanor assured him. "The Reverend and his wife will be there." Mr. Simmons did not look entirely convinced, but he nodded. "You ever need anything, you come back to town and let me know. I don't forget loyalty." His kindness brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. She had been so focused on survival these past months that she had not realized there were still people in Fort Worth who cared what happened to her. Reverend Matthews and his wife, Constance, invited Eleanor to supper on Thursday evening to discuss the arrangements. The Reverend was a gentle-faced man in his early 60s with wispy gray hair and warm brown eyes. His wife was plump and cheerful, despite the obvious stiffness in her joints that made her movements slow and careful. "Russell is a good man," Constance Matthews assured Eleanor over roast chicken that made Eleanor's mouth water. It had been so long since she had eaten a proper meal. "He came to us 3 Sundays ago when he first arrived in Fort Worth. Told us his plans for the ranch and asked for our prayers and guidance. I have a sense for people, dear, and that young man has an honest soul." "How long will you be staying at the ranch?" Eleanor asked, trying not to sound too anxious about the answer. "At least through the winter," the Reverend said. "My wife's health requires it, and I can minister to the scattered ranches and settlements in the area just as well from Russell's land as from town. Perhaps better, as I'll be closer to where most of the people actually live. Come spring, we'll reassess." That was more time than Eleanor had dared hope for. By spring, she would know Russell's true character, and the ranch would either be thriving or failing. Either way, she would have options and maybe even some money saved. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, with a hint of autumn's coolness in the air despite the August date. Eleanor had packed her trunk the night before, carefully folding the 3 dresses she owned, her extra set of undergarments, her mother's silver hairbrush, and the few books she had managed to keep when the farm was sold. Everything she had left in the world fit into one small trunk with room to spare. Russell arrived promptly at 8 o'clock with a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 strong horses. He helped Eleanor carry her trunk down from her room, and she noticed he lifted it as if it weighed nothing, his arms corded with muscle beneath his rolled-up shirt sleeves. Mrs. Calloway watched from the doorway, her expression sour with disapproval. "I hope you know what you're doing, girl," the landlady said. "A woman's reputation, once lost, can never be regained. Then it's fortunate that I'm taking every precaution to maintain mine," Eleanor replied coolly. "Good day, Mrs. Calloway." They collected the Matthewses and their considerably larger amount of luggage, and by mid-morning they were finally heading north out of Fort Worth, the town falling away behind them as the open prairie stretched ahead. Eleanor sat on the wagon bench beside Russell, while the Reverend and his wife were settled comfortably in the back with cushions and blankets. The day was beautiful, with wildflowers dotting the grasslands in splashes of yellow and purple. Hawks wheeled overhead in the crystalline blue sky. The air smelled of sun-warmed earth and sage. As frightening as this change was, Eleanor felt something loosening in her chest, some tight band of anxiety that had constricted her breathing for months. Out here, away from the cramped boarding house and the pitying or judgmental stares of townspeople, she could breathe again. "It's beautiful," she said without thinking. Russell glanced at her, pleased. "It is. That's what I thought when I first saw this country, hard but beautiful." "Honest, if that makes sense." "It does," Eleanor said, and realized it was true. There was an honesty to the prairie, to the endless sky and the harsh sun. It demanded strength but offered freedom in return. "What brought you to Texas?" she asked. "You don't sound like you're from around here." "Missouri originally," Russell said. "Spent some time in Colorado after the war, tried my hand at various things, saved what I could. Finally decided I wanted my own land, my own place. A friend told me about the ranch that was for sale up here. Previous owner's children wanted to sell fast and get back east, so I got it for a good price." "The war," Eleanor repeated. "You fought." Russell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Last 2 years, joined up when I was 17, saw things no one should have to see, lost friends. Lost part of myself, maybe. When it was over, I just wanted to find somewhere quiet and build something instead of tearing things down." His voice had gone distant, and Eleanor recognized the haunted look that sometimes crossed his features. She had seen it before in men who had fought. Her father had been too old for conscription, thank God, but neighbors had gone and some had not come back, and those who did were different, hollowed out in ways that could not quite be named. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Russell shook his head as if clearing it. "Long time ago. This is better, this life. Or it will be, once I get the ranch running properly." They rode in companionable silence for a while. Behind them, Eleanor could hear Constance Matthews humming tunelessly and the Reverend reading aloud from his Bible. The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically, and the horses' hooves made a steady clip-clop against the packed earth of the trail. After about 2 hours, Russell pointed ahead. "There. That's the boundary of the property." Eleanor saw nothing but prairie at first, but as they continued, the land began to change slightly. There were more trees here, cottonwoods and willows that indicated water nearby. The grass grew lusher and greener. Then, cresting a low rise, she saw the house. It was a 2-story structure made of weathered wood, with a sagging porch and several broken windows. The roof looked intact, at least, though some shingles were missing. Behind the house stood a barn in better condition and a series of corrals. In the distance, Eleanor could see cattle grazing, perhaps 30 or 40 head. "I know it doesn't look like much," Russell said, a note of apology in his voice. "But the bones are good. The foundation is solid, the framing is sound. It just needs work." Eleanor studied the house with a practiced eye. She had helped her father maintain their farmhouse for years and had learned to see beyond surface problems to underlying structure. Russell was right. The house was shabby and neglected, but it was not beyond saving. "It needs a lot of work," she said honestly. "But it's possible. The porch will need rebuilding. Those windows need to be replaced before winter. The whole place needs a thorough scrubbing inside and out, and probably fresh paint wherever we can manage it. The garden's completely overgrown, but the fence is still there, so that's something." Russell looked at her with surprise and growing respect. "You can see all that just from here." "My father taught me to assess a property," Eleanor said. "He said knowing what was wrong was the first step to making it right." They pulled up in front of the house, and Russell helped everyone down from the wagon. The inside was even worse than the outside, with dust and debris everywhere, furniture covered in old sheets, and the pervasive smell of disuse and decay. But as Eleanor walked through the rooms, mentally cataloging what needed to be done, she felt a strange sense of excitement building. This was not just cleaning up someone else's mess. This was making a home. The house had a good layout. Downstairs was a large main room with a fireplace, a kitchen with a cast iron stove that would need cleaning but looked functional, and a small bedroom that would suit the Matthewses. Upstairs were 3 more bedrooms, smaller but adequate. Eleanor could take one, Russell another, and the third could serve as storage or a guest room. "Well," Constance Matthews said, hands on her hips as she surveyed the dusty main room, "we'd best get started. Reverend, you help Mr. Whitaker unload the wagon. Eleanor and I will see about making these rooms habitable enough to sleep in tonight." They worked until well after dark, sweeping and scrubbing, opening windows to air everything out, making up beds with the linens they had brought. Russell proved handy with repairs, fixing the pump in the kitchen so they had water, replacing broken window panes with oiled paper until proper glass could be obtained. The Reverend, despite his age, pitched in gamely, moving furniture and hauling debris outside. By the time they sat down to a late supper of cold ham and bread, everyone was exhausted but satisfied. They had managed to make the house marginally livable. Tomorrow they would tackle deeper cleaning and more substantial repairs. Eleanor fell into bed that night too tired even to feel anxious about her new situation. Her room was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the prairie. The bed was more comfortable than her narrow cot at the boarding house, and the air smelled of grass and clean wind instead of unwashed bodies and cooking grease. She was asleep within minutes of her head touching the pillow. The next weeks fell into a rhythm. Eleanor woke before dawn to start breakfast for everyone. After they ate, she would tackle a different area of the house, scrubbing and cleaning and organizing. Russell worked on the more substantial repairs and tended to the cattle and horses. The Reverend helped where he could and took long walks around the property, visiting neighboring ranches to introduce himself. Constance, limited by her rheumatics, sat on the now repaired porch and did mending or helped prepare vegetables for meals, her fingers slow but steady. Eleanor had never worked so hard in her life, but she had also never felt so satisfied. There was a difference, she discovered, between the soul-crushing labor of scrubbing floors for pennies and the demanding but meaningful work of building a home. Each room she cleaned, each curtain she sewed, each meal she cooked felt like an investment in something larger than herself. She also began to know Russell better. He was a quiet man, not given to unnecessary chatter, but when he spoke, it was always with consideration and often with flashes of dry humor that surprised her. He was unfailingly polite to everyone, patient with setbacks, and harder on himself than anyone else when things went wrong. She saw him working from before dawn until after dusk, saw him collapse exhausted into bed only to rise the next morning and do it all again. One evening in early September, about 3 weeks after they had arrived at the ranch, Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing supper when Russell came in from the barn. She glanced up and saw him favoring his left hand, holding it gingerly against his chest. "What happened?" she asked, setting down the knife she had been using to chop vegetables. "Nothing. Just caught my hand on a nail, it's fine." "Let me see." Russell hesitated, then extended his hand. There was a nasty gash across his palm, still bleeding freely. Eleanor's stomach clenched. In this heat, in these conditions, infection was a constant danger. "Sit down," she ordered. "That needs to be cleaned and bandaged properly." She heated water, retrieved clean cloth from her carefully hoarded supplies, and set to work. Russell sat quietly while she cleaned the wound, his jaw tight against the sting of the hot water and soap. She was acutely aware of his nearness, of the heat radiating from his body, of the way he watched her face while she worked. "You're good at this," he said quietly. "I've had practice. My father was always injuring himself on the farm. Farmers are terribly accident-prone, and ranchers are even worse, I'm learning." She smiled despite her concentration. "Hold still. I need to wrap this tight to stop the bleeding." As she wound the cloth around his palm, her fingers brushed against his skin. She felt him tense at the contact, and when she glanced up, she found him looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch. It was not the lascivious look she had learned to recognize and fear from men in the saloon. This was something else entirely, something deeper and more dangerous to her peace of mind. "There," she said, her voice coming out slightly breathless. "That should hold. Try to keep it clean and dry. Come find me tomorrow and I'll change the bandage." "Thank you, Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal miss, and hearing it in his low voice sent an odd shiver through her. She busied herself with putting away the medical supplies, trying to ignore the way her heart was racing. After that evening, something shifted between them. The formal courtesy remained, but there was an undercurrent now, an awareness. Eleanor found herself watching Russell when she thought he was not looking, admiring the way he moved, all economical grace despite his size. She noticed the way sunlight caught in his dark hair, turning it almost auburn. She noticed the rare smiles that softened his features and made her want to say or do whatever it took to provoke another. And she caught him watching her, too. When she hung laundry on the line she had strung up behind the house, when she worked in the garden they were slowly reclaiming from weeds, when she sat on the porch in the evening with mending in her lap. His gaze was not intrusive or possessive, but it was present, and she felt it like a physical touch. October brought cooler weather and the first real test of the ranch. A neighboring rancher, a man named Briggs who owned a much larger spread to the west, rode up one afternoon with 2 of his hands. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as Russell went out to meet them. She could not hear the conversation, but the body language was not friendly. Briggs, a large man with a florid face and an aggressive posture, seemed to be doing most of the talking. Russell stood his ground, his stance relaxed but unmistakably firm. After about 10 minutes, Briggs and his men rode off and Russell came inside. His face was carefully neutral, but Eleanor could see the anger in the set of his shoulders. "Trouble?" she asked. "Briggs thinks he has a claim to the water rights on the creek that runs through the property. Says the previous owner had an agreement with him." "Did he?" "Not according to the land deed. The creek and all water rights are legally part of this ranch. Briggs is just used to taking what he wants because he's the biggest rancher in the area. Reverend Matthews, who had been reading in his chair by the fireplace, looked up with concern. Will he cause problems? Maybe, Russell admitted, but the law is on our side. I filed all the proper claims in Fort Worth when I bought the place. If Briggs pushes it, we'll settle it in court. But Briggs, it seemed, was not inclined to let the law settle matters. A week later, several head of Russell's cattle went missing. Then someone cut the fence on the north pasture, requiring a full day's work to repair. Russell never directly accused Briggs, but everyone knew who was behind the harassment. Eleanor saw the strain wearing on Russell. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, and she often saw him standing on the porch late at night, staring out at the dark prairie as if expecting trouble to come riding up at any moment. One such night, unable to sleep, Eleanor came downstairs for a glass of water and found him there. The moon was nearly full, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. Russell was leaning against the porch rail, his profile sharp and troubled. "Can't sleep?" Eleanor asked softly, not wanting to startle him. He glanced back at her. "Didn't mean to wake you. You didn't." "I was already awake." She came to stand beside him, looking out at the same view. The prairie was beautiful in the moonlight, peaceful and vast. "What are you going to do about Briggs?" "Keep my head down and hope he loses interest," Russell said. "I can't afford a range war. I've got barely enough cattle to make it through the winter, and if I lose many more, I'll have to sell the ranch." The despair in his voice hurt her heart. "It won't come to that. You don't know that." "No," Eleanor agreed, "but I know you're not the kind of man to give up easily. And I know this ranch is worth fighting for." Russell turned to look at her fully. The moonlight made his eyes seem luminous. "Why did you really say yes to coming here?" he asked. "It wasn't just the money, was it?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "It wasn't just the money. I said yes because I was drowning and you threw me a rope. I said yes because I wanted something more than just survival. I wanted to live, really live, and I thought maybe here I could do that. And can you? Live, I mean." "Yes," Eleanor said, and realized it was true. Despite the hard work, despite the uncertainty, despite the very real danger that Briggs might drive them all out, she felt more alive than she had in years. "Yes, I can." They stood in silence for a long moment, and Eleanor was intensely aware of the small distance between them, of how easy it would be to close that gap, of how much she wanted to. But she did not move, and neither did Russell, and eventually, the moment passed. "You should get some sleep," Russell said gently. "Tomorrow's another long day." Eleanor nodded and went back inside, but she felt his gaze following her all the way to the stairs. November brought the first real cold, and with it, the need to lay in supplies for winter. Russell made a trip to Fort Worth with a list of necessities that Eleanor had compiled. Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, bullets for the rifles, nails, more glass for the remaining broken windows, cloth for warmer curtains, kerosene for the lamps, and 100 other small things that added up to survival. He returned 3 days later with a loaded wagon and news that Briggs had been in town spreading rumors. Russell had been accused of stealing cattle, of jumping a claim, of being a con man and a cheat. None of it was true, but in a small town like Fort Worth, rumors had power. "Did anyone believe him?" Eleanor asked, her stomach tight with anxiety. "Some did. Some didn't. Porter at the hotel vouched for me, and Reverend Matthews's reputation helped. But there's doubt now, and doubt is poison in a community like this." Winter settled over the ranch like a cold blanket. The work became harder in the freezing temperatures, but there was also less of it. The cattle had to be fed and checked daily, but there was no garden to tend, no major repairs that could be done in the cold. They all spent more time inside, huddled around the fireplace, making do with lamplight when the sun set early in the afternoon. Christmas came, and they celebrated quietly. Eleanor made a dried apple pie with their hoarded supplies, and Russell produced a bottle of whiskey he had bought in town. They sang carols together, Constance's quavering soprano blending with the Reverend's deep bass and Russell's surprisingly tuneful tenor. Eleanor, who had never been confident in her singing, hummed along and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. That night, Russell gave her a present. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, and Eleanor stared at it in shock. She had not expected anything, had not thought to prepare anything for anyone else beyond the pie. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "Open it," Russell urged. Inside was a pair of leather gloves, soft and well-made, lined with fleece. Eleanor ran her fingers over them, overwhelmed. Her old gloves were worn through, and her hands had been suffering in the cold. These were beautiful, practical, and must have cost more than Russell could afford. "Russell, this is too much," she said, her eyes stinging with tears. "No," he said firmly. "It's not nearly enough. You've worked harder than anyone should have to, and you've made this place a home. You deserve to have gloves that actually work." Eleanor looked up at him, and in his eyes she saw something that made her heart stutter. He cared for her, not just as an employee, not just as a housekeeper, but as a woman. The realization was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "Thank you," she whispered. That winter seemed endless, but it was also strangely intimate. Thrown together in the small house, unable to escape each other's company, the four of them became a kind of family. The Reverend told long, rambling stories about his years as a circuit preacher. Constance taught Eleanor more elaborate sewing techniques and shared recipes from her youth. Russell read aloud from books in the evening, his voice bringing to life adventures in far-off lands. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Russell and Eleanor drew closer. It was nothing overt, nothing that could be remarked upon. But he began to sit beside her in the evenings instead of across the room. She began to pour his coffee just the way he liked it without asking. He noticed when she was tired or troubled and found small ways to ease her burden. She noticed when his hand bothered him, the injury from the nail never quite healing properly in the cold, and made poultices to help with the pain. February brought a blizzard that snowed them in for 5 days. They were all trapped inside, and by the third day, everyone was getting on everyone else's nerves. The Reverend and Constance bickered about trivial things. Eleanor snapped at Russell over some minor household matter. Russell retreated into brooding silence. On the 4th day, desperate for space, Eleanor bundled up in her warmest clothes and ventured out to the barn. The snow had finally stopped, though it lay in drifts up to her waist in places. The cold was brutal, but it was also clean and quiet after the close confines of the house. She was brushing down one of the horses, finding the repetitive motion soothing when the barn door opened and Russell came in, snow dusting his hat and shoulders. "I should have known I'd find you here," he said. "Needed some air," Eleanor replied, not looking at him. "Eleanor, about earlier, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have been so short with you." "I was short with you first," she admitted. "I'm sorry, too. I'm not used to being cooped up with people for so long." Russell came to lean against the stall door, watching her work. "You're good at that. The horse likes you." "Animals are easier than people," Eleanor said. "They're honest about what they want." "Are people not honest?" Eleanor paused in her brushing. "Not always. Sometimes we want things we're not supposed to want. Sometimes we feel things we're not supposed to feel." The air in the barn suddenly felt charged, electric. Russell moved closer, and Eleanor could feel the heat of him even through their layers of clothing. "And what if," Russell said slowly, carefully, Both people felt the same things, wanted the same things. Would that make it all right? Eleanor's hand stilled on the horse's flank. Her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. "I don't know," she whispered. "Maybe. But only if they were honest about it, only if they both understood what they were risking." Russell reached out and gently took the brush from her hand, setting it aside. Then he took both her hands in his, mindful of her healing skin, and looked directly into her eyes. "I care about you," he said. "More than I should, probably. More than an employer should care about an employee. More than is smart or practical or sensible. But I can't help it, Eleanor. You're strong and brave and kind, and every day I see you working to make this place better, I fall a little bit more in love with you." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. "Russell, you don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I don't want you to feel pressured. You work for me, and I know that complicates things. But I couldn't go another day without telling you the truth. Even if you don't feel the same way, even if you want me to take you back to Fort Worth tomorrow, I needed you to know." "You foolish man," Eleanor said, half laughing, half crying. "Of course I feel the same way. I've been trying not to for months now, but it's no use. I'm in love with you too." Russell's face transformed with joy. And then he was kissing her, his cold lips warming against hers, his arms coming around her to pull her close. Eleanor melted into him, into the kiss, into the glorious, terrifying reality of loving and being loved in return. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Russell rested his forehead against hers. "I want to marry you," he said. "Properly, with the Reverend performing the ceremony, with everything right and honorable. Will you marry me, Eleanor Preston?" "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married 2 weeks later in the main room of the ranch house, with Reverend Matthews presiding and Constance crying happy tears throughout the ceremony. Eleanor wore her best dress, dark blue calico that Constance had helped her alter to be more flattering. Russell wore his only suit, brushed clean and pressed as well as could be managed. They spoke their vows in front of the fireplace, promising to love and honor each other for as long as they both lived. That night, Eleanor moved her few possessions into Russell's room, which was now their room. She was nervous, having no experience with men, but Russell was gentle and patient. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, Eleanor felt transformed. She was no longer Eleanor Preston, the desperate woman who scrubbed floors for pennies. She was Eleanor Whitaker, a rancher's wife, a woman building a life and a home with the man she loved. Spring came, and with it, new challenges and new joys. The Reverend and Constance prepared to return to Fort Worth, as they had always planned. Constance's health had indeed improved with the change of air and the relative peace of ranch life, and the Reverend was needed in town. Before they left, the Reverend pulled Russell aside for a private conversation. When Russell emerged, he looked thoughtful and pleased. "The Reverend says Briggs has been having money troubles," Russell told Eleanor later. "Gambling debts, mostly. Word is he may have to sell off part of his ranch to cover what he owes. If he's dealing with his own problems, maybe he'll leave us alone." The Reverend's information proved accurate. Briggs stopped harassing them, and the ranch finally had a chance to thrive. Russell hired 2 ranch hands, young men who had worked for other spreads and were looking for better prospects. With more help, Russell was able to expand the herd, and Eleanor was able to focus more on the house and garden without being completely overwhelmed. By summer, the ranch was starting to look prosperous. The house had fresh paint and new curtains. The garden was producing abundantly. The cattle were fattening on good grass. Russell and Eleanor worked side by side, partners in every sense of the word. One warm June evening, Eleanor was washing dishes after supper when she felt Russell come up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder. "I've been thinking," he said. "That's dangerous," Eleanor teased. He laughed and turned her in his arms so she faced him. "I've been thinking about how lucky I am, how different everything could have been. Different how? If I hadn't gone into that saloon that day. If you hadn't been brave enough to take a chance on me. If any of 100 small things had gone differently, I wouldn't have this. I wouldn't have you." Eleanor reached up to cup his face, feeling the rasp of stubble against her palm. "I'm the lucky one," she said. "You saw me at my lowest point and offered me hope. You gave me a future when I had none." "We gave each other a future," Russell corrected. "This is ours together." In September, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The realization filled her with both joy and terror. Childbirth was dangerous, especially out here far from town and doctors. But when she told Russell, his face lit up with such pure happiness that her fears faded, at least for the moment. "A baby," he breathed, his hand coming to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Russell said. He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as if she were made of glass. "I'm going to take care of you, both of you, I promise." The pregnancy was not easy. Eleanor suffered from terrible sickness in the early months, barely able to keep food down. Then, as winter set in again, she grew large and uncomfortable, her back aching and her ankles swelling. But through it all, Russell was devoted. He took over many of the household tasks, helped her with everything she needed, and sat with her in the evenings reading aloud or simply holding her hand. In late March of 1880, on a mild afternoon with spring flowers just beginning to bloom, Eleanor went into labor. Russell rode hard to fetch the midwife who lived on a neighboring ranch, a capable woman named Mrs. Hudson, who had delivered half the babies in the county. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day, but finally, just as the sun was setting on March 24th, Eleanor delivered a healthy baby boy. Russell, who had been pacing downstairs in an agony of worry at every cry from Eleanor, took the stairs 3 at a time when Mrs. Hudson called him up. He entered the bedroom to find Eleanor propped up against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. "Come meet your son," Eleanor said softly. Russell approached almost reverently and looked down at the red, wrinkled little face of his child. The baby had a shock of dark hair and tiny perfect fingers that wrapped instinctively around Russell's when he offered one. "He's beautiful," Russell said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're both beautiful. Eleanor, you're amazing." They named him James after Russell's father who had died before the war. James Russell Whitaker, the first child born on the ranch, the first of what Eleanor hoped would be many. The next years passed in a blur of hard work and happiness. The ranch prospered, growing slowly but steadily. Russell expanded the herd and improved the bloodlines. Eleanor managed the household and raised James, who grew into a sturdy, curious little boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin. In the summer of 1882, Eleanor gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Rose. Unlike her brother's difficult birth, Rose arrived quickly and easily, as if she were eager to join the family. She had her father's blue-green eyes and her mother's blonde hair, and from the beginning, she had Russell wrapped around her tiny finger. The ranch hands who worked for Russell became almost like family. There was Tom, the older of the two, a steady man in his 30s who had been a soldier with Russell and followed him west. And there was Jack, younger and more impulsive, but a hard worker who treated Eleanor with unfailing respect. Between them, they kept the ranch running smoothly, allowing Russell more time with his growing family. Eleanor's life had become something she never could have imagined on that August day when she knelt scrubbing floors in the Lucky Star saloon. She had a home, a husband who loved her deeply, two beautiful, healthy children, and a future that stretched before her full of promise instead of despair. One evening in the fall of 1883, Eleanor was sitting on the porch watching the sunset while Rose napped in her cradle and James played with his wooden toys nearby. Russell came to sit beside her, his arm going around her shoulders in the easy intimacy of long marriage. "Do you ever think about Fort Worth?" he asked. "About what your life might have been if things had gone differently?" "Sometimes," Eleanor admitted, "but not with regret. Everything I went through led me here to this life. I wouldn't change it even if I could. Not even the hard parts. The hunger, the scrubbing floors until your hands bled." Eleanor considered this. "Not even those. They taught me what I was capable of. They taught me how to survive and how to value what really matters. And they brought me to the exact place I needed to be when you walked into that saloon." Russell smiled and pulled her closer. "I still remember what you looked like that day, so fierce and proud even on your knees. I knew right then you were special." "You knew I was desperate," Eleanor corrected with a laugh. "That too, but also strong. I needed someone strong. This life isn't easy." "No," Eleanor agreed, looking out at the ranch they had built together. "It's not easy, but it's good, it's real. It's ours." James abandoned his toys and climbed into his father's lap, and Russell settled him comfortably, pointing out a hawk circling in the distance. Eleanor watched her husband teaching their son, watched the golden light of sunset painting the prairie in shades of amber and rose, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. The years continued to unfold, each bringing its own challenges and rewards. In 1885, Eleanor gave birth to twin boys, Samuel and Daniel, who kept everyone on their toes with their energy and mischief. The ranch house had to be expanded to accommodate the growing family, and Russell added 2 more rooms upstairs and a proper dining room downstairs. By 1888, the ranch was well established and respected in the community. Briggs had indeed sold off most of his land and moved back east, removing the threat that had once loomed over them. New neighbors had moved in, decent people who became friends. The church in Fort Worth started holding occasional services at the ranch for the scattered community, with visiting preachers staying with the Whitakers. Eleanor had become known for her hospitality and her skill at managing a large household. Women came to her for advice on preserving food, on treating childhood ailments, on how to make a home in the harsh prairie climate. She had become part of the community in a way she never had been in Fort Worth, respected not pitied, valued for her contributions rather than judged for her circumstances. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books and learning. Eleanor taught him to read using her mother's old Bible and the few books they had managed to accumulate. Russell taught him to ride and rope and handle cattle, passing on the skills needed to eventually take over the ranch. Rose was wilder, always wanting to be outside, always getting her dresses dirty, much to Eleanor's exasperation and secret delight. She could ride almost as well as her older brother and had no fear of anything, which gave Eleanor constant heart attacks but also filled her with fierce pride. The twins were a handful, identical in appearance but opposite in temperament. Samuel was quiet and cautious, Daniel bold and impulsive. They got into everything and required constant supervision, but they also brought joy and laughter to the household in equal measure. In the spring of 1890, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. She was 34 now, and the pregnancy was harder than the others had been. She tired more easily and suffered from aches and pains that had not plagued her with the earlier children. Russell hovered over her constantly, worried but trying not to show it. "I'm fine," Eleanor assured him repeatedly. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I've done this 4 times already." "You're not getting any younger," Russell said bluntly, then winced at his own tactlessness. Eleanor laughed despite herself. "Thank you for that reminder, husband. You certainly know how to flatter a woman." But secretly, she shared his concerns. She was not as young or as resilient as she had been with James. This pregnancy felt different, heavier somehow, and she was relieved when her time finally came in November. The labor was long but not as difficult as she had feared, and she delivered a healthy baby girl they named Grace. Grace was small and dark-haired like her father, with a solemn, watchful expression even as a newborn. Eleanor looked down at her 5th child and felt a profound sense of completion. This was her family, these were her children, and this was the life she had built from nothing. The 1890s brought continued prosperity, but also challenges. Drought years made ranching difficult, and there were seasons when they had to cull the herd more than Russell wanted. But they weathered each crisis, drawing on the resilience and determination that had brought them together in the first place. The children grew. James, at 15, was nearly as tall as his father and starting to take on real responsibility around the ranch. Rose, at 13, had lost some of her wildness but none of her spirit. The twins, at 10, were finally starting to develop individual identities beyond being the twins. And Grace, at 5, was a quiet, thoughtful child who loved to help her mother in the garden. In the summer of 1895, the Whitakers took a rare trip to Fort Worth. They needed supplies that could not be obtained locally, and Eleanor wanted to show the children where she and Russell had first met. The town had grown considerably in the 17 years since Eleanor had left. There were more buildings, more people, more signs of civilization pushing back the wild frontier. Eleanor stood outside the Lucky Star saloon, which was still there though under new management. Russell stood beside her, the children arrayed around them. "This is where your father first found me," Eleanor told them. "I was inside scrubbing floors trying to earn enough money to survive." "That must have been hard, Mama," Rose said sympathetically. "It was," Eleanor agreed. "But it brought me to your father, and that made everything else worthwhile." James, pragmatic as always, asked, "Why didn't you have any family to help you?" "My mother died when I was young, and my father died when I was 22. I had no one else." "Sometimes life takes everything from you, and you have to build back from nothing. That's what I did. That's what your father helped me do." Russell put his arm around Eleanor's shoulders. "Your mother saved herself," he said to the children. "I just gave her a different place to do it. She's the strongest person I've ever known." They walked away from the saloon, through the busy streets of Fort Worth, and Eleanor felt like she was visiting a foreign country. This place had been her whole world once, and now it was just a town, nothing special, nothing frightening. She had outgrown it, moved beyond it, become someone who would never again need to scrub floors for pennies. That night, staying at the hotel that Porter still managed, Russell and Eleanor lay together in the darkness. The children were in adjoining rooms, probably not asleep yet but contained. "Do you regret it?" Eleanor asked. "Taking a chance on a desperate woman scrubbing floors?" Russell turned to face her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Not for one single moment. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Eleanor. You and our children, this life we've built. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Even the hard parts, the winters when we weren't sure we'd make it. The times when the ranch barely turned a profit, even those. Especially those. They made us stronger. They made us appreciate what we have." Eleanor kissed him, a long, slow kiss that still, after all these years, made her heart race. "I love you, Russell Whitaker. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Thank you for giving me a chance." "I love you too," Russell said. "And you were never invisible. You were always extraordinary. I just happened to be the one lucky enough to notice." They returned to the ranch renewed and refreshed, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The children fell back into their routines, the work of the ranch continued, and life went on in its beautiful, ordinary way. As the century drew to a close, Eleanor sometimes stood on the porch of her home and thought about the girl she had been 17 years ago. That girl would not recognize the woman she had become. That girl had been broken and desperate, with no hope and no future. This woman was strong and confident, surrounded by family, secure in her place in the world. The ranch had grown to over 5,000 acres, one of the most successful in the region. Russell had become a respected voice in the community, someone other ranchers came to for advice. Eleanor herself was known for her wisdom and generosity, always ready to help a neighbor in need, always willing to share what she had learned. In the winter of 1899, as the world prepared to welcome a new century, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. At 43, she had assumed her childbearing years were behind her, and the news was both shocking and slightly terrifying. Pregnancies at her age carried significant risks, and both she and Russell knew it. "We'll get through this," Russell said, his face lined with worry despite his reassuring words. "You're strong, Eleanor. You've always been strong." "I'm also not 22 anymore," Eleanor pointed out. "This is going to be difficult." It was. The pregnancy was hard from the beginning, with constant fatigue and illness. But Eleanor was determined to see it through, to give this unexpected child the same chance she had given the others. On a cold February night in 1900, with the new century barely begun, Eleanor went into labor. It was the longest, most difficult labor she had ever experienced, and there were moments when even the midwife looked worried. But Eleanor was not ready to leave this world, not ready to leave Russell and her children, and she fought with every ounce of strength she possessed. Just before dawn, she delivered a son. He was small, smaller than any of her other babies, and for a terrifying moment, he did not cry. Then Mrs. Hudson, the same midwife who had delivered James 20 years earlier, managed to get him breathing, and his thin wail filled the room. "You've got another boy," Mrs. Hudson said, placing the baby in Eleanor's arms. "Small but fierce, just like his mother." They named him Matthew, and he became the baby of the family, doted on by his older siblings. Despite his difficult start, he thrived, growing stronger each day. Eleanor recovered more slowly than she had from previous births, but with Russell's devoted care and the help of her older children, she gradually regained her strength. The first decade of the new century passed peacefully. James, now a grown man of 25, took over more and more of the ranch's operations, allowing Russell to step back slightly. Rose married a young rancher from a neighboring spread, a good man who treated her well and gave Eleanor her first grandchildren. The twins went to work on the ranch full-time after finishing their schooling, becoming skilled cattlemen. Grace, quiet and bookish, surprised everyone by announcing she wanted to become a teacher and began studying with that goal in mind. Matthew grew into a lively, intelligent boy who seemed to have inherited the best traits of all his siblings. He had James's thoughtfulness, Rose's courage, the twins' humor, and Grace's curiosity about the world. In the spring of 1908, Eleanor and Russell celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary. Their children organized a party at the ranch, inviting neighbors and friends from all over the region. Eleanor, now 52 years old, looked around at the crowd of people laughing and eating and celebrating, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. She found Russell standing slightly apart from the crowd, watching the festivities with a contented smile. She came to stand beside him, and he immediately put his arm around her waist. "Quite a turnout," he observed. "They came for you," Eleanor said. "You're respected, Russell. You've earned it." "We've earned it," Russell corrected. "None of this would exist without you. This ranch, this family, this life. You're the heart of it all, Eleanor. You always have been." Eleanor leaned into him, fitting perfectly against his side after 3 decades of practice. "Do you remember that day in the saloon when you first asked me to come work for you? Of course. You looked at me like I was either crazy or dangerous, maybe both." "I thought you might be both," Eleanor admitted with a laugh. "I was terrified, but also hopeful, which was maybe even more frightening than the fear." "I knew the moment I saw you that you were special," Russell said. "I told myself I was just offering you a job, just trying to help someone in need. But even then, I think I knew it was more than that." "Love at first sight," Eleanor teased. "Maybe not love at first sight," Russell said thoughtfully, "but recognition, like my soul recognized yours. Like I knew, even if I didn't understand it yet, that you were the person I'd been waiting for." Eleanor turned in his arms to face him fully. "I love you, Russell Whitaker. Thank you for walking into that saloon 30 years ago. Thank you for seeing me, for believing in me, for giving me a chance at this life." "I love you too," Russell said. "And as for seeing you, believing in you, giving you a chance, you had all that in you already. I just got to be there while you became who you were always meant to be." They kissed, right there in front of all their guests, and a cheer went up from the crowd. Their children groaned in embarrassment, but there was love in the sound, love and acceptance of parents who had built something real and lasting. As the years continued to pass, Eleanor watched her children grow into their own lives. James married a schoolteacher from Fort Worth and had 3 children of his own, raising them on a section of the ranch that Russell deeded over to him. Rose had 4 children with her rancher husband and was perfectly content with her life. The twins both married within a year of each other and started their own families. Grace did become a teacher, running a small school on the ranch for the children of the area. Matthew, the baby, showed signs of wanting to become a doctor, inspired by the traveling physician who had occasionally visited the ranch over the years. Russell began to slow down as he entered his 60s, not dramatically but noticeably. The ranch work, which had once been easy for him, now left him tired. He spent more time in the house, more time sitting on the porch, more time simply enjoying the fruits of decades of labor. Eleanor, too, felt the passage of time. Her hair had gone completely silver, and her hands, which had once been raw and bleeding from scrubbing floors, were now gnarled with age. But they were capable hands still, strong hands that had built a life. In the summer of 1920, Eleanor and Russell celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. The party was even larger than the one for their 30th, with children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and friends filling the ranch house and spilling out onto the lawn. Eleanor, at 74, moved more slowly but was still sharp as ever, directing the preparations with the skill of someone who had organized countless gatherings. Russell, at 76, sat in a chair of honor, surrounded by family. His dark hair had gone completely white, and his face was deeply lined, but his eyes were still that striking blue-green, and when he looked at Eleanor, they still held all the love of a young man seeing his bride for the first time. During the party, James stood up to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who showed all of us what it means to build a life together, to weather storms together, to love each other through everything. You started with nothing but each other, and look at what you've created. This ranch, this family, this legacy. We're all here because you had the courage to take a chance on each other." Everyone raised their glasses, and Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. Happy tears, grateful tears, tears of a life well lived and fully appreciated. That night, after all the guests had left and the house was quiet, Eleanor and Russell sat together on the porch, just as they had so many nights over the decades. The prairie stretched before them, peaceful in the moonlight. 50 years, Eleanor said softly. Where did the time go? Into this, Russell said, gesturing at the ranch, the house, the life around them. Into building something that will last long after we're gone. Do you think we succeeded? Eleanor asked. Do you think it will last? I know it will, Russell said with certainty. Look at our children, our grandchildren. They have our strength, our determination. They know how to work hard and love deeply. That's a legacy that will endure. Eleanor leaned her head on Russell's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had shared a lifetime and had no need for words to communicate what was in their hearts. The years passed, slower now, quieter. Russell's health declined gradually, and by 1925 he was largely confined to the house. Eleanor, despite her own advanced age, cared for him with the same devotion he had shown her through 5 pregnancies and countless illnesses over the years. Their children wanted to hire nurses, wanted to make things easier, but Eleanor refused. I've been taking care of this man for 47 years, she said firmly. I'm not stopping now. Russell died peacefully in his sleep on a warm May night in 1926. He was 82 years old, and Eleanor, lying beside him, woke to find him gone. The grief was enormous, a tearing pain in her chest that made it hard to breathe. But along with the grief was gratitude. They had been given 58 years together, more than most couples could hope for. They had built a life, raised a family, created something beautiful out of nothing. The funeral was enormous, with people coming from all over Texas to pay their respects. Russell Whitaker had been a pillar of the community, a man respected and admired by all who knew him. But Eleanor knew that what mattered most was not his public legacy but his private one. The love he had given to her and their children, the quiet acts of kindness and devotion that made up a marriage. After Russell's death, Eleanor moved into the main house with James and his family. She was 80 years old and could no longer live alone, though she still insisted on doing as much for herself as possible. She helped with the great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, about the early days of the ranch, about what it had been like to build a life from nothing. Eleanor lived 4 more years, remaining sharp and engaged until the very end. On a cool October evening in 1930, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, Eleanor Preston Whitaker passed away peacefully at the age of 84. She was buried beside Russell on a hill overlooking the ranch, the prairie stretching endlessly around them. Her children had a stone carved with both their names and the dates of their lives, but also with a single line. They built a life together. The ranch continued, passed down through the generations. James ran it until his own sons were old enough to take over. Rose's children started their own ranches nearby. The twins' families stayed on the land, working cattle and raising children. Grace's school became a permanent fixture, educating children throughout the region. Matthew became a doctor as he had dreamed, serving the scattered communities of rural Texas. The house itself became a kind of museum, lovingly maintained by the family, filled with photographs and mementos of Eleanor and Russell's life together. Future generations would walk through those rooms and hear the stories, learning about the woman who had scrubbed floors for pennies, and the man who had told her the only floor she would ever scrub again would be their home. And they had built that home together, not just the physical structure but everything it represented. Love, partnership, resilience, determination, hope. They had taken two broken lives and woven them together into something beautiful and lasting, a legacy that would endure for generations. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the hardships they had faced, not the struggles or the fears, but what they had created together. A family, a home, a love that had weathered everything and emerged stronger for it. Eleanor and Russell Whitaker had proven that sometimes all it takes is one chance, one moment of courage, one person willing to see beyond the surface to the strength beneath. And from that single moment in a Fort Worth saloon in August 1878, when a desperate young woman scrubbed floors and a compassionate young man offered her hope, had come an entire world. A world of children and grandchildren, of laughter and hard work, of love that grew deeper with each passing year. A world built on nothing more than two people who believed in each other and were willing to fight for the life they wanted. It was, in every sense, a legacy of love. And it would endure, passed down through stories and memories, through the land itself, through the lessons Eleanor and Russell had taught by the simple act of living their lives with courage and devotion. They had shown everyone who came after what was possible when two people refused to give up, refused to accept that their circumstances defined their future, and instead built something new together. The only floor Eleanor Whitaker ever scrubbed after that day in the Lucky Star Saloon was indeed the floor of her own home, the home she and Russell created together out of love and determination, and an unwavering belief that they deserved better. And in the end, they got it. They got everything they had dreamed of and more. A full, rich life that proved that sometimes the best stories begin with a simple act of kindness and a willingness to take a chance on another human being.